Granddaughter was 9 years old when she saved my life. I didn't know that's what she was doing at the time. I thought she was just being a nervous kid. The way she kept looking over her shoulder at the airport drop-off lane, twisting the strap of her little backpack around her fingers until her knuckles went white. My daughter had just disappeared through the sliding glass doors. Business trip to Phoenix, 3 days, and I was reaching for my granddaughter's hand to walk her back to the car when she stopped dead on the sidewalk and looked up at me with those big brown eyes and said, very quietly, "Grandpa, I don't think we should go home right now." I almost laughed. Almost. Something in her voice stopped me. Kids that age, they whine, they complain, they drag their feet, but they don't speak in that particular register. Low and careful and certain, like they're delivering news they've rehearsed 100 times and still aren't sure how to say. "Why not, sweetheart?" I asked. She glanced back at the doors where her mother had just gone in. Then she looked up at me again. "Because I heard them talking last night. Dad and Uncle Roy. They were in the kitchen after you went to bed. I was supposed to be asleep, but I was thirsty, and I sat at the top of the stairs, and I heard them." I crouched down to her level there on the sidewalk, with cars honking around us, and a skycap rolling luggage past us, and the whole ordinary chaos of an airport morning going on, and I asked her what she heard. She said, "They said they were going to call someone, a doctor, and make you go somewhere, and that the house would be easier to deal with if you weren't in it." I remember the way the sounds around me went strange after that, muffled, like someone had pressed cotton against my ears. I remember the smell of jet fuel and the scratch of concrete through the knee of my pants. I remember thinking, she's 9. She might have misunderstood. But then I looked at her face and I knew she hadn't. Let me back up. Let me tell you who I am and how I got here. Because none of this makes sense without that. My name is Walter Greer. No, I'm sorry. Let me start differently. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a high school history teacher in Dayton, Ohio. And when my wife Pauline died 4 years ago, something went out of me that I'm still not sure came back all the way. We'd been together since we were 19. She was the one who remembered where I put my keys and which neighbor's dog was named what, and which nephew's birthday fell in March versus April. Without her, I drifted a little. That's the only honest word for it. Drifted. My daughter, she's 34, sharp as a tack, works in logistics. She suggested I come live with her family about 2 years ago. Her husband and I had never been what I'd call close. But I wasn't going to say no to being near her and near my granddaughter, who at the time was 7 and just learning to read chapter books, and had recently decided that the best possible Saturday afternoon involved sitting in my lap while I read to her in voices. So I sold the house in Dayton. I moved into the in-law suite they had built over the garage. It was a good arrangement, or I thought it was. My son-in-law had a brother. Let's call him Roy, because that's his name. Roy came around often, too often, really. And he and my son-in-law would sit out on the back patio, drinking and talking in voices that got quieter whenever I came outside. I didn't think much of it at the time. Men like that talk about money and sports and other men's problems. I figured I was probably one of those problems occasionally. Most fathers-in-law are. What I didn't know was that Roy had found himself in serious financial trouble about 8 months before all this. A business deal gone sideways, or maybe several. I only found out the full picture later, in a lawyer's office. Reading documents I still have trouble believing were real, but the short version is this. Roy had convinced my son-in-law that my house, the in-law suite, the property, really the whole arrangement, was an asset that could be leveraged if I wasn't around to complicate things. And a way to make sure I wasn't around to complicate things was to have me declared incompetent. 67 years old, retired teacher. I still do the Sunday crossword in pen, but none of that matters when someone decides to make a case against you. And they had started making one, back to the airport sidewalk. I stood up, took my granddaughter's hand, and walked to the car. I didn't take her home. I drove to a diner about 4 miles away, the kind with vinyl booths and laminated menus, and I ordered her hot chocolate and myself coffee. And I asked her to tell me everything she remembered, word for word, as best she could. She was remarkably precise. Kids often are, when it actually matters. She said Roy had used the word evaluation. She said my son-in-law had said it doesn't have to be permanent, just long enough. She said she heard Roy say the name of a facility. She couldn't remember the whole name, but she remembered it had Meadow in it. I held my coffee cup with both hands to keep them from shaking. I have a brother, older than me by 9 years, retired now. Lives about 40 minutes away. His name is Calvin. We have never once in our lives agreed on anything important, politics, parenting, how to properly grill a steak, but he is the steadiest person I have ever known, and he answers his phone on the second ring at all hours without complaint. I called him from the diner. I told him where I was and what my granddaughter had told me. There was a pause on the line, and then Calvin said, "Don't go back to that house. Come here. Both of you." I looked across the table at my granddaughter. She was dragging her finger through the whipped cream on her hot chocolate, drawing something. "Okay," I said. "Calvin's house is the kind of lived-in that Pauline used to call aggressively comfortable. Stacks of fishing magazines, 3 mismatched recliners, a dog named Archie who has one job in life and takes it very seriously, which is to lie across the feet of whoever needs it most." He laid across my granddaughter's feet almost immediately. She put her hand on his back and stopped fidgeting. My brother made soup from a can and toast from a loaf of bread that had seen better days, and we sat at his kitchen table while my granddaughter watched something on Calvin's ancient tablet, and I told him everything in order. Calvin is not a reactive person. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he put both hands flat on the table and said, "Do you have a lawyer?" I had a lawyer in Dayton for the house sale. I still had his number saved. I called him the next morning. A man named Douglas Hatch, who had the slow, careful voice of someone who thinks before speaking, which I've always found deeply reassuring. I explained the situation. He asked a series of very precise questions. Then he told me that what I was describing, a coordinated effort to have a competent adult declared incompetent for the purpose of controlling their assets, was not just unethical, it was potentially criminal, and that the first thing I needed to do was document everything. "Do you still have access to financial records?" he asked. "Bank statements, property documents, anything relating to your assets." I had paper copies of everything in a fireproof box in the in-law suite, which I no longer had access to. I didn't go back to the house that day, or the next. My son-in-law called twice, texted once, asking where we were. I didn't answer. My daughter called from Phoenix, and I told her we were fine, staying with Calvin, that everything was okay. She didn't push. She trusted me. I don't know if I made the right call, keeping her out of it those first few days, but I was afraid of what would happen if I said too much over the phone. What I didn't tell her was that on the second night at Calvin's, I borrowed his old pickup truck and drove by the house at around 10:30 in the evening. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. Dark blue sedan, no plates visible from where I sat. A light was on in what used to be my room above the garage. I drove back to Calvin's and sat in the driveway for a long time before going in. Here's something nobody tells you when you're in the middle of something like this. The hardest part isn't the fear. The fear is clean in a way. It has an edge to it, a direction. The hardest part is the grief underneath the fear. The grief of realizing that people you loved, people you sat across from at Christmas dinner and helped move furniture for and trusted with your proximity, had been looking at you and calculating. My son-in-law had called me Dan for almost 5 years. I thought about that a lot at Calvin's kitchen table, while Archie laid across my feet. Douglas Hatch moved quickly once he had the picture. He reached out to a colleague in our county who handled elder law, a woman whose name I will not give because she asked me not to, but who had what I can only describe as a prosecutorial energy dressed in a cardigan. She was 60-something herself, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a voice that could have cut glass. I liked her immediately. She told me that the process Roy and my son-in-law were likely pursuing was a guardianship petition, a legal mechanism meant to protect people who genuinely cannot make decisions for themselves, but one that is sometimes weaponized, particularly against elderly people who have assets and family members with motivation. "Have there been any doctors involved?" she asked. Anyone your son-in-law might have taken you to see recently may be framed as a routine checkup? I thought about it. 3 months before, my son-in-law had offered to take me to a doctor's appointment. He said my daughter had been worried about my memory. I had been mildly annoyed, but I'd gone. Because what was I going to say? That I was refusing to see a doctor? It had seemed like a normal visit. The doctor had asked me a series of questions. What year is it? Who's the president? Count backward from 100 by sevens, and I'd answered them all without difficulty, or so I thought. The doctor had been neutral in that professional way that tells you nothing. When I told her this, she set her pen down on the legal pad and looked at me. That may have been a cognitive evaluation, she said. Depending on how it was documented and by whom, it could be used as part of a guardianship filing. The room felt very small suddenly. Can they do that? I asked, on the basis of one appointment I didn't know was an evaluation. They can try, she said. Our job is to make sure trying is all they do. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life, which is saying something for a man who taught teenagers for 3 decades. We couldn't stay at Calvin's indefinitely. He had his own life, and my granddaughter needed to go back to school. My daughter had returned from Phoenix and was now fully in the picture, which created its own complications. She was devastated. She was also furious in the particular way of a person who has to simultaneously absorb that her husband had been lying to her, and that her father had been in danger, and that somehow she had been in the middle of it without knowing. I watched her sit very still at Calvin's kitchen table for about 20 minutes one evening, not saying anything, and then she picked up her phone and called her husband and said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, I need you to tell me the truth right now, because my lawyer is going to find it anyway. He didn't tell her the truth that night. He told her Roy had just been talking, that nothing was filed, that it was all a misunderstanding. She didn't believe him. She had her mother's instincts. What she didn't know yet, what none of us knew yet, was that Roy had in fact filed a preliminary petition 8 days earlier. Douglas Hatch's colleague found it, a petition for limited guardianship over my person and estate, citing concerns about my cognitive function, signed by 2 people I had never met, listed as concerned parties. When I read that document, I had to put it down and walk outside and stand in Calvin's driveway for a while. The sky was very gray. Archie followed me out and sat on my feet. 2 people I had never met. Roy had apparently recruited them. How, or what he told them, or whether they fully understood what they were signing, I still don't entirely know, but there they were, in legal print, 2 names attached to claims about a man they had never spoken to. My attorney filed a response within 48 hours. It was 41 pages long. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've heard versions of stories like this where the legal machinery is summarized in a sentence or 2, and that's never felt honest to me. The truth is that what followed was 3 months of depositions and document requests, and a hearing date that kept shifting, and phone calls at odd hours, and a folder on my brother's kitchen table that got thicker every week. Roy's lawyer was good, I'll give him that. He was a careful, methodical man who built his case slowly and without obvious malice, which almost made it worse. He painted a picture of an elderly man in decline, forgetful, occasionally confused, not quite managing the demands of daily life. And he did it with a kind of gentle concern that made my skin crawl precisely because it was designed to. My attorney was better. She subpoenaed the records from that doctor's appointment. What she found was that the doctor had documented the visit as a routine wellness exam and had noted no significant cognitive concerns. Roy had apparently been told as much, but had decided that didn't matter, that the filing itself, the process, would be enough to achieve what he needed, which was delay and disruption and access to paperwork my son-in-law could influence. She also subpoenaed Roy's financial records. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. He wasn't just in debt. He was in the kind of trouble that has lawyers involved on both ends, the kind that makes people desperate enough to do things they would never have considered in a calmer moment. My son-in-law, to his credit, or maybe just to his self-preservation, began to cooperate with my daughter's attorney sometime in the 2nd month. He submitted a declaration stating that he had not initiated the petition, that Roy had presented it to him as already in process, and that he had not fully understood the implications. Whether that was true or a version of the truth or a strategic choice, I honestly don't know. My daughter knows him better than I do, and she made her own decisions about what to believe. What I know is that when the hearing finally happened, on a gray Tuesday morning in a county courthouse that smelled like old carpet and industrial cleaning solution, I sat at a table next to my attorney and I answered every question clearly and directly and at length, because I am 67 years old and I spent 32 years explaining things to people who didn't always want to listen, and I know how to hold a room. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses, not unlike my attorney's. She listened to everything. She asked me several questions directly. She asked Roy's lawyer several questions in a tone that suggested she had already read the subpoenaed documents carefully. The petition was denied. Roy's attorney was untied. Roy's attorney was informed that any refiling without substantially new evidence would be viewed as harassment. Roy himself, who had sat at the opposing table throughout the hearing in a charcoal suit and very expensive shoes, left without looking at me. I watched him go. I felt a lot of things, standing there in that courtroom. Relief, obviously. Some anger still, but mostly I felt tired in the way you feel tired, after something is finally over. The deep kind of tired that isn't quite sad, but is adjacent to it. My granddaughter was at school when the hearing happened. I picked her up that afternoon, the same way I'd been picking her up 3 days a week for the past 2 years. She got in the car and threw her backpack in the back seat and said, "Did it go okay, Grandpa?" I told her it went okay. She nodded, like she'd expected that. Then she asked if we did stop for ice cream, because she'd had a spelling test and she'd gotten 100 and felt it warranted celebration. We stopped for ice cream. She got strawberry in a waffle cone and got it on her jacket almost immediately, and I handed her a napkin from the glove compartment, and she leaned against my arm in the passenger seat and ate her ice cream while I drove. And the afternoon light came through the windshield at that particular late October angle that makes everything look like the end of something good rather than the beginning of something bad. I thought about Pauline. I thought about how she would have handled all of this, sharper than me, probably, faster to see it coming. I thought about the house in Dayton, and the fireproof box, and the 32 years of teaching, and the Sunday crosswords, and all the ordinary pieces of a life that someone had tried to use against me. I thought about a 9-year-old girl sitting at the top of the stairs after midnight, thirsty, listening. My daughter and her husband are working things out, or working on working them out. I don't know exactly what that looks like day to day. She doesn't share every detail with me, and I don't ask. What I know is that she moved through this with more grace than I would have managed in her position, and that she looked her husband in the eye in a way that made very clear she had not forgotten and would not forget, which is, I suppose, both a warning and an invitation. Roy is gone, out of their lives, out of mine. Whatever consequences followed from his financial situation, from the legal exposure the subpoenas created, from the conversation his brother apparently had with him, I was not part of any of that. I let it go. I had to. The in-law suite over the garage is mine again. My fireproof box is back on the shelf where it belongs. On Sunday mornings, I do the crossword at the kitchen table downstairs while my granddaughter eats cereal, and sometimes she leans over and gives me letters I didn't ask for, and sometimes she's right. I still think about that Tuesday at the airport. The honking cars, the rolling luggage, the way she looked up at me and said what she said. I've tried to understand what it cost her, a 9-year-old, to make that call, to have sat at the top of the stairs and heard what she heard and then carried it through a whole airport drop-off and waited until her mother was gone and then said quietly, precisely, what needed to be said. She's told me since that she was afraid I wouldn't believe her. I asked her what made her tell me anyway. She thought about it for a moment, the way she does, with her eyes slightly unfocused and her spoon stopped halfway through her mouth. And then she said, "Because you're my grandpa, I wasn't going to just not tell you." There are things that happen in a life that you don't know how to hold. You can't make them make sense, not fully. You can't fit them into the story you thought you were living. All you can do is carry them forward. The fear and the grief and the ordinary miracle of a child who sat at the top of the stairs and listened, and then, when it mattered most, told the truth. That's enough. Some days, it's more than enough.